What's up, men? In this video, I'm going to talk about our current situation of testosterone for men, especially in their 40s and up. I'm going to talk about why we're in this situation and what we can do about it, and really how we know what to do about it. So let's first start with the current situation. So our current situation isn't pretty. So we're sitting at about a 50% level of testosterone of what our fathers had just a generation 50 years ago. We're interestingly also about at a 50% fertility rate of what we were about a generation and a half ago. About chronic disease, how are we doing with that? Diabetes, obesity, and dementia, all that stuff. That's on a huge rise in the last generation. About cancer rates, cancer is now on pace to outdo cardiovascular as the primary cause of death for Americans. So cancer is on a huge rise. How about longevity, how long we're living on average? That is now, for the first time in our American history, is on the decline. Every generation from the beginning of our history in America here has increased. The next generation has increased. We are now on a decrease. Not a good trajectory. About quality of life. You can just go look around at all the nursing homes, not looking pretty. Even when we're living till 70, it's not looking pretty. These things, again, just to remind you, this has been in the last 40 to 50 years' time. You can't just keep going on this trajectory at this rate. This is not looking pretty. So one of the questions, of course, is why has this happened? And I think there's a bunch of reasons. There's a good grouping of reasons. And all these things that I'm going to mention are things that have happened in the last generation or two primarily. So about food first. Number one, food is no longer locally grown or used or eaten. Most food comes from an average of hundreds, even like 1,000 miles away. So we're importing food from all kinds of places. We've condensed our agriculture and created kind of, you got to be big farm or you're out. And that's how we subsidize it in this country, especially. A lot of our food is lab experiments. So chemists playing around in the labs and then giving it to us for food. And not only directly us, but also the animals that we eat. So we've got that. We've pretty much depleted our soils at crazy high rates with how we farm, with pesticides and whatnot. And we have managed to turn our water gay. So our water is extremely estrogenic and full of medications that have been dumped into the water supply. So there you go with food, not looking pretty. Of course, one of the headliners there is how we've created these seed oils that are now like 20% of our American diet. So we've got food. How about the environment we live in? So of course we've got things like the EMFs. Our clothing is made of xenoestrogens. Fragrances and everything is disruptive of our hormones. We've got like zero connection almost with the sun and the dirt from the earth. I think the latest statistic is that office workers spend like 96% of their day indoors, don't even see the outdoors at all. We've got, of course, computers, screens, the blue lights, entertainment. We sit for long periods of time for that stuff. Skin products, everything we're putting on our skin. All of these things have changed just in this recent time period the most. These have changed over time, but to a greater degree. How about work? So of course we got computers that I mentioned already. We've got some sedentariness where there are arguments to say like, well, that's not a huge factor. It's probably maybe a small factor, but I think some people make it the factor, that we sit a lot. And I don't think that it is such a huge factor. I've got some reasons for that. But the other part of work really taps into the social part. And that is that men especially have been disconnected from the blessing that their product provides. So imagine the factory worker who's just making the blade for the lawnmower. He's just making blades, making blades, making blades. But he never actually sees that full product and never sees it actually put into the hand of the guy who's using it to be a blessing to mow his lawn. So we have a disconnection there. We have a disconnection with many workers, with kind of a sovereignty or an ability to control what's going on in a business or the company. And there are actually studies that show that people that work and have very little control over what goes on in the business have shorter lifespans significantly than those who had more say or more control or express more creativity in their work. So a lot to say under social. We've obviously got social media, which is kind of like a false social aspect. We've got superficial relationships, especially at our church. Maybe you have a men's breakfast once a quarter or something like that. You've got the whole, like, we move around all the time. We can move state to state, even country to country. Isn't that strange? And so family ties get broken. Church ties are bouncing around all over the place. So lots to say in that area. So all these things have really significantly changed, and these things together, it's not really one thing, but these things all together would be quite enough to make these kind of changes. When you think about it and you talk about it, all these factors, you actually say, like, how did we make it this far? We're only 50%. It could be worse. So what's going on? What are the effects of all of these changes? I think there are two main principles that will help us be able to figure out how to address these issues. So steady. There we go. The first main principle we're going to talk about is this principle of peacetime versus wartime. And what I'm talking about here is our brain, our body, has a perception of the environment or the context we're in. And it will act very differently based on where it thinks we are. So this is huge. This is super important, especially if you're concerned about your testosterone, muscle building, fat loss, because it is very hard to do the things we want when we're in a state of wartime, or at least our body thinks that we are in a wartime kind of state. So what are some of those peacetime activities that happen when our body is in that state? So some of those things are higher testosterone production, higher libido, higher fertility. So these are some of the things that we've dropped in quite a bit. Related to the brain, higher creativity, vision creating, strategy, risk taking, calculated risk taking. All of those things are going to function better in a peacetime like state or mentality. Muscle gain is another big one, because muscle tissue is very expensive to hold on to. It's kind of like having a muscle car in the garage. It might require better fuel. It's going to cost more for repairs. And if, the household budget is plummeting, then it's like, you got to sell that muscle car, got to get rid of it. And your body does the same thing with muscle tissue. Your body's repair mechanisms, through sleep especially, are going to be affected. So your body's going to be much better at repairing degenerative tissues or problematic tissues when you're in a peacetime state. And those are all things that are kind of like nice to haves. If, however, you are more in a wartime state, and this is a spectrum, so you can be, anywhere along this spectrum. You might be way over here on the great side. You might be somewhat in the middle. You might be sort of on the wartime side. So it's a spectrum. It's not an either or. So what happens when you're in a wartime state? Well, in a wartime state, what your body is going to want to get rid of muscle tissue. All those things we talked about over there in the peacetime are deprioritized. So like your testosterone, your libido, fertility, those are all things put way back on the back burner. Why? Because your body thinks it's in Wartime, it thinks famine's coming any minute now, high stress, and so it thinks survival. Wartime is survival is prioritized. So all those other things, those nice to haves, are sold, at a garage sale, depending on how far down the wartime path you are. All right, so makes sense? If your body is in a state of peacetime, at least if it's perceiving it's in a state of abundance or peace, all those things like testosterone, libido, fertility, and muscle building are going to come easy. If it thinks you're in survival mode, perhaps now this makes sense. Fat is your survival tissue. Fat is your survival tissue. So if your body perceives you're in survival mode, wartime mode, is it going to want to get rid of your fat? No. That's kind of like, think of like a psychotic prepper. He's going to hold on to that fat because that means survival and doom is imminent. All right. So that's principle number one. So there's two main principles that's on the spectrum. One more thing about one very important question to ask is, well, what drives this? What drives you more to peacetime versus wartime? And check out my driver. Cool guy, that's you. This is your metabolism. So your metabolism is the driver. When your metabolism is weak, then you're going to be more in this wartime state. When your metabolism is strong, and by strong I mean it's running efficiently and it's not producing a lot of smoke when it takes in food as fuel and turns it into energy, it's going to burn clean and it's strong. And that part of that is also your gut. Are you bringing in nutrition? Is it getting to your mitochondria to create that energy? And then if it does get there, is it producing strong? Is it producing efficiently, kind of like a factory? So if your metabolism is strong, the stronger it is, the more you're going to signal peacetime in your body. Okay, so metabolism is the main driver of what your body perceives its state is. All right, principle number one, peacetime versus wartime spectrum. Number two principle here is what we call the hormone teeter-totter. So this is important because as you're in that peacetime state, androgens, or a lot of these positive hormones, all of these that I list here aren't exactly androgens, but they fit into the same category. They kind of go together, they travel together somewhat. Androgens go up. And we call this the teeter-totter because anytime you have one side of this equation going up, the other gets pushed down. So the catabolic hormones, this group, you could also call them the stress hormones, they tear down. So in other words, they're going to take things like muscle tissue, bone tissue, even organ tissue, break it down and either store it as fat, kind of like that prepper mentality, or just use it to create more of these stress hormones that are prepared for war. So if your body's in that state of wartime, you need to build up the military, in other words, in that sense. And that's what it's going to spend the energy on. It's going to tear down those things that it doesn't necessarily need for survival, like your muscle tissue, your bone tissue. Your brain isn't going to get as much energy. That's why creativeness and vision, thinking critically, those are all peacetime activities. All right, so if that tears down the androgenic hormones, what do you think those do? These are your building hormones. So they're going to build those nice to haves up, like testosterone, like muscle tissue. So what are those androgenic hormones? Those are going to be things like testosterone, and DHT is kind of like the high T version of testosterone. You've got DHEA, progesterone, pregnenolone. Thyroid is very important because thyroid is the main driver of your metabolism, which is driver of you wanting to be in that peacetime state. So thyroid is a big, important one. Dopamine, insulin actually is an interesting one too, which is why we don't want to be low carb. Now I have muscle on here because muscle, as many will now say and agree with, muscle acts as a hormone. It's signaling things to the rest of the body and changes body functions just by existing. So when you have a lot of muscle tissue, it's going to encourage all of these things. What were all those things? Those were things like your testosterone, your libido, your fertility, your creativity, all those things on this side of the equation. All right. Now, on the other side of the equation, we've got these catabolic hormones here. These are purposeful. They're not bad in of themselves, but they're meant to be rarely used, kind of like a generator for a house. It's not meant to power the whole town. It's meant to power a few things in your house for a very short period of time. So these all have, these are actually very necessary for survival-like activities. They keep you from going into like a coma, especially cortisol if your blood sugar gets too low. Estrogen helps with big wounds and proliferating cells to help heal those wounds. So there's a lot of good things for those hormones, but they're kind of meant to sit in the background, stay seated, and stay out of the way unless they're needed. However, they can run amok, take over a whole town with bricks and break down windows and crush businesses. They can act like that in the body when they are pushed up. Now I have fat listed here because fat is also, in the same sense as muscle, hormone-like. So it is going to be signaling things like the more fat you have, it's going to signal things like we need to produce more estrogen. So more fat produces or signals the production of more estrogen. And you create kind of a cycle here of holding on to the fat. That fat signals more estrogen and it keeps you in that cycle. All right. So hopefully that provides a good picture. Those two principles, remember those two principles, we've got the peacetime versus wartime spectrum driven by metabolism, and you've got this hormone teeter-totter. One goes up, the other is driven down, and vice versa. All right, so those two main principles are going to really drive how we get out of this big mess right here that we're in. So these two principles drive things like how we're going to eat and drink, including supplementation. So can we have supplements, in other words, that help drive these hormones down in order to allow those androgenic hormones to be driven up? So it's going to affect how we work and how we sleep, how important we consider sleep, how we train as well, because if we're just adding a bunch of cortisol to the bucket from overtraining, all we're doing is really pushing these catabolic hormones up, even with something we think is good like exercise, depending on how we do it and when we do it. So it's important to know these two principles, how we connect, how we interact with our wife, including sex and frequency, and then how we interact with brothers and how we think. Those things are really actually quite connected, even to testosterone and driving the androgens up. And then how we structure our environment as well. So the things we buy, the way we live our lives, how much time we're outdoors versus indoors, etc. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful to give you that big picture. I want to give us all hope because this situation looks very bleak. But when we get these principles down, we do have ways of turning this around, of turning your body more to a peacetime state through driving these androgenic hormones up. And a big piece of that right in the center is our metabolism. So guys, this is what I do for guys in my program too. If you want to help with that, if you want to dig a little deeper and have specific help on nutrition, how to exercise, how to raise those hormones, how to supplement well, then I do that through my course on skool.com. That's skool.com. But you'll find all that on my website, mysaltyfitness.com. And you can also just check out anything else that I put out there on YouTube and on LinkedIn or X. You can find a lot of stuff. I try to put a lot of value out there. So check that stuff out. You can learn a lot, hopefully, in this journey, because you're really in a war to keep and maintain and even win back, in some cases, our testosterone, our fertility, our creativity, our drive, our leadership. There's definitely a war on men, among other things, in this time and in this culture. So fight back, brother, and hit me up if I can help you in any other way.